couple of decades that it is monetary policy that should be used to stabilize business cycle fluctuations. But a question that got us interested a bit more recently is whether or not a central bank can manage business cycle fluctuations in the same way in extreme events like the COVID recession or in more milder states of the world. And one answer that we received from the empirical literature is no. The way in which a central bank intervention transmits to the real economy is very different across states of the world. So, for example, the very influential work by Silvana Tenreira and Gregory Twice has shown that the same intervention by a central bank, which occurs in an expansionary state of the world, transmits much more strongly to real GDP than the same intervention in a recessionary state of the world. We also know from the work by Oskar Jorda and co-authors that an intervention in the state of the world with loose credit can do a lot more to the real economy than the same intervention in a state with tight credit. And finally, very recent work by Guido Ascari and Timo Haber has shown that as the central bank scales up the magnitude of its intervention, the response of the real economy scales up less than linearly. So you're running out of steam as you're making intervention extremely large. So those are the empirical regularities that I hope we all agree are useful and relevant for both policymakers and central banks and to academics. But one unfortunate feature is that these sort of nonlinearities cannot be reconciled very well, even in the fully nonlinear versions of the state-of-the-art, New Keynesian sticky price models, which we use in central banks and in academia. So there's almost no nonlinearity, even in the fully nonlinear versions of those. And it's just this kind of discrepancy between the empirically observed nonlinearities in the transmission of monetary intervention and the lack of ability of our existing models to, speak to those. It's something which motivates this specific paper. So what I'll do today is I'll show you a novel tractable framework for rationalizing a range of nonlinearities in monetary transmission to real variables, where all of those nonlinearities will be driven by only one new mechanism, which, as I'll show, will find support in both aggregate and microdata. So more specifically, what I'll do is I'll show you a sticky price model with input-output linkages, so nothing novel about the first two parts. But the crucial, novelty is that those input-output linkages will be formed endogenously. So there'll be states of the world with in the model with very, dense input-output linkages, with a lot of them across firms and sectors, and states of the world with very few linkages, and whether or not to have those linkages will be an endogenous decision made by firms in the model. So before digging into the details of why you get the nonlinearities, let us just remind ourselves that whenever you combine input-output linkages with sticky prices, the degree of non-neutrality of money gets amplified in these models. Why? Because firms inherently, inherit the stickiness from their suppliers. So if I have a supplier who doesn't adjust prices by a lot, my marginal cost becomes very slow moving, which in turn makes my price setting more slow moving as well. So this is the inheritance of price stickiness, which you always have in these models. Now, whenever you have input-output linkages formed endogenously, the degree of this contagion of price stickiness becomes state-dependent. So whenever you have a state of the world with very dense input-output linkages, you'll have a lot of contagion of price stickiness and hence a lot of non-neutrality of money and very strong sensitivity of the real economy to central bank decisions. On the other hand, whenever you have a state of the world with very, sparse input-output structure, this contagion of stickiness will weaken, which will then lower the non-neutrality of money and lose the ability of the central bank to control the real economy. That's the crucial mechanism of this paper. So any state of the world with more linkages will feature stronger contagion of price stickiness or stronger pricing complementarities, which in turn strengthens the real effects of monetary policy. And I would actually, before explaining anything further, let's summarize this mechanism even more intuitively in one slide. So imagine the whole economy only consisted of two sectors, one of which had perfectly flexible prices, and the other one had perfectly sticky prices. And imagine they were not connected by input-output linkages, they just operated in isolation. Then if a central bank engineers a monetary easing, the consumption in the sticky sector will increase because it will not adjust its prices upwards, whereas consumption in the flexible price sector will remain unchanged. Only the sticky price sector responds. Imagine the very same two sectors that were interconnected by input-output linkages. So now the flexible price sector has the sticky price sector's price in its marginal cost. Then, following the very same monetary easing, consumption in the flexible price sector will increase. So even though firms in the flexible price sector can always adjust their prices perfectly, the fact that their marginal cost now has a sticky component will ensure that their prices are not adjusting one for one with money supply, and hence consumption in that sector is increasing. Similarly, consumption in the sticky price sector is also increasing by more than before. Why? Because you have second round effect. So the sticky price sector buys from the flexible price sector, which buys from the sticky price sector. So ultimately, the sticky price sector inherits its own stickiness through this higher order effect. Its price setting becomes more sluggish. It doesn't adjust prices upwards by as much as before, which means consumption increases by more than before. That's the broad logic. Well, now we have more of these links. Price setting becomes more sluggish, doesn't follow money supply as much, which means adjustment is happening through real quantities, which is the very definition of non-neutrality of money. Okay, so that's the mechanism in one slide. Now, the model will actually tell us more than that. First, it will give us, yes?
Hi, Mishel. I'm here, Marco from the bank. So yeah, going back to your slide with this mechanism, does it matter the direction of this? Like I would imagine, like you're showing here that the relationship is like goes in both directions, but I could also imagine that if it's the flexible price sector is only buying but not selling to the sticky price sector, then the solid line we should expect to go up by less than in the non-connected sector on the left, right? So is it only about the linkages, or is it also about the direction and intensity of these links?
So certainly the quantitative relevance of this mechanism depends on the direction of links, but not the kind of qualitative direction of this. So you can never inherit flexibility in this setting. For sure, as long as wages are flexibly set. So in the sense that whenever you decide to buy something from the other sector, you're relying less on wages and relying more on prices. But if you're connecting yourself to a perfectly flexible sector, almost as if nothing changes. So what can happen is that by connecting to someone, you're not gaining more stickiness, but you can never inherit more flexibility.
Okay.
But quantitatively, it can matter. I mean, this will become clearer once we dig into the math of this. But as a general kind of broad overview of this, you can always, as long as wages are flexible, you can always inherit stickiness. You can never inherit flexibility.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the question. So as I said, the model will tell us actually a bit more than this. So it will give us very tight guidance on what are the states of the world in which there will be more or fewer linkages. In particular, any states of the world with either higher productivity, lower desired markups, or higher money supply will endogenously generate more links. And the mechanism which gives us this result is very intuitive. So firms in the model will be making the following decision. For a fixed set of tasks they need to perform to produce the good, they can either perform each task with in-house labor or by outsourcing this task to another firm and hence forming a link with it. Whenever there's a rise in productivity or a drop in desired markups, the prices that are charged by your potential supplier drop relative to the nominal wage you need to pay to your workers, which makes it cost minimizing for you to outsource more of your tasks and hence form more links. Similarly, following an increase in money supply, because prices are sticky, the prices set by your potential suppliers do not increase by as much as the nominal wage you need to pay to your workers, which means it becomes relatively cheaper to outsource some of your tasks and do less in-house, and hence you decide to form more. So this is the reason why in these quote-unquote expansionary states of the world with more productivity, lower desired markups or higher money supply, you would see more links. So links will be procyclical in this model. And this procyclicality of input-output linkages turns out to be enough to explain at least the three empirically established nonlinearities from the very first slide of this presentation. So first, there'll be cycle dependent. The monetary transmission to real GDP is going to be stronger in expansion. So transmission is procyclical. Why? Because in all of these expansionary states of the world, so there'll be more linkages, hence stronger contagion of price stickiness, and hence stronger transmission of central bank decisions to the real economy. Second, there'll be path dependent. So the effect of monetary policy on GDP is stronger whenever it's preceded by episodes of loose monetary policy. Why? Because loose monetary policy today generates more links, which means any subsequent intervention by a central bank, either contractionary or expansionary, will be occurring in the state of the world with more links, stronger contagion of stickiness, and hence more non-neutrality. And that's the path dependence result. Finally, they'll be size dependent. So large shocks will not transmit proportionally to small shocks to the real economy. So for example, a very large monetary contraction will break links, which will weaken the contagion of stickiness and weaken non-neutrality of money, which means the response of GDP will be less than proportional to what would happen in a model with exogenous links. So in a sense, as you increase the size of the monetary contraction, you're running out of steam because you're destroying links which are giving you the power to affect the real economy in the first place. And crucially, this size dependence holds even if the probability of price adjustments is completely exogenous, like in the Calvo model. So although you have purely time-dependent pricing, you can still have size-dependent responses of the real economy to monetary shock. Finally, in time permitting, I'll give you novel model-free empirical evidence on the cyclicality of production network in the United States, and in particular how it responds to both monetary and real shocks, and show that it's procyclical just like it is in the model, both conditional on productivity shocks or monetary shocks driving the cycle. That's the paper in a nutshell. And unless there are further questions, I'll dig into the details of this. No questions, so let's jump in. So just right before, the details briefly on the contribution. So there's a very big and growing, or not big, growing literature on endogenous networks in macroeconomics. Some people at the Central Bank of Chile have also contributed to this literature. I already apologize that they have not been mentioned here. But this is the first model with endogenous networks and nominal rigidity. This is the first model with sticky prices, basically, and endogenous formation of links. And I believe this is also the first paper to provide empirical evidence on how production networks respond to both monetary and productivity shocks in the United States. And then this also contributes to the literature on state dependence in monetary transmission. So this literature has been mainly empirical, so documenting the various nonlinearities, and the few existing theoretical frameworks tend to tackle one nonlinearity at a time. And I believe the contribution of this paper is to also show you a framework which can rationalize multiple dimensions of nonlinearity with only one mechanism. So a brief roadmap for today. I'll begin with a two-period simple version of the model where I believe a lot of the results are going to be very transparent and analytically tractable. Then to quantify the effects, I'll show you an infinite horizon version of this model, which I'll calibrate to 389 sectors of the US economy and show you a numerical mechanism of how such a model, which is calibrated to a lot of sectors and fully forward-looking, can be solved. And the final part of the presentation will be the model-free empirical evidence. So let's make a start on the two-period setting. So here, everything is very simple. In period one, prices are sticky. In period two, prices are flexible. I care about the effects of monetary shocks. I only care about period one, which means I drop any time subscripts for simplicity. On the structure, there's a continuum of firms, which are kind of subdivided into K sectors. and each firm only belongs to one of the sectors. Then there's a continuum of households whose job is to supply labor to the firms. The firms are making pricing decisions, possibly subject to nominal rigidities, and the crucial novelty is that firms were making endogenous decisions whether or not to be connected to each other. And that's the crucial innovation on top of the otherwise standard model. More concretely, each of the firms has access to a Cobb-Douglas production technology, which has three parts. There's a productivity part, AK, which is actually allowed to be a mapping from SK, which is a set of sectors you choose to buy inputs from, to the productivity that you get. So there's an exogenous mapping, which is known to everyone, which takes the set of sectors you want to buy inputs from and gives you the productivity associated with that choice. Then there's the labor input, NK, and there are the intermediate inputs, ZKR. For each task that a firm needs to perform to produce the good, there's a preset cost share, omega KR. If you choose to outsource this task, the cost share appears as an exponent on the relevant intermediate input. Everything you choose not to outsource has to be produced in-house, so that the exponent on the labor input is 1 minus the sum of the cost shares on things you choose to outsource. So effectively, your decisions about outsourcing are endogenous to pinning down the exponents or on your production function, or basically choosing the production function you'll be having. But crucially, there's a restriction that remains constant returns to scale, no matter what you choose.
Why do you have, Mishel, why do you have this on productivity? This sort of, so I guess you're saying that you're going to have a direct effect on who you're buying to, who you're buying from, on productivity indirectly, sort of independently on the effect that it's going to have on prices and marginal costs.
So the point of this AK term is just to capture this idea that certain tasks are fundamentally not outsourceable. So if you try and outsource something, you would, or rather some things are either very outsourceable or not very outsourceable. So if you try and outsource something which is not very outsourceable, you'll get a very low productivity associated with it. So imagine I am a plant producing cars, and I previously outsourced my legal advice, but I now try and do this legal advice in-house because someone had a college degree in law. Maybe that person is not as good as a professional lawyer. And if I try to stop this outsourcing, I would get a very low productivity associated with that.
Yeah, but you have that already. I mean, why do you need something on top of the shares? I guess the shares should already have some information of those costs, right? Like,
yeah, so this is just reinforcing this effect.
So why do you need that on top of whatever is in the data on the shares?
So let me put it this way. So you do not need this to be a mapping for the analytical result, but quantitatively, it just turns out that when you calibrate this model for many sectors, without something like that, you would often get pushed into corner solutions where you'd either want to outsource everything or you want to outsource nothing. This AK mapping provides extra discipline for you to settle on an intermediate sort of or interior solution on what are the things you want to outsource.
Okay.
So this is more of a quantitative device ultimately, and it's not important for the analytical results here.
May I jump in?
Yep.
Ernesto here from the bank. So I wonder about the production function structure because, well, here I'm being a little bit unfair. I've seen the paper before, but what is critical to me, at least, is the exponent in labor, which here depends on the number of links only, not on the intensity of use for each particular type of input. So that comes naturally from a Cobb-Douglas production function. I wonder whether in a more general type of production function, we could care also about the intensity of the links and not only about the number of links.
This is a great question, Ernesto. So in the paper, it's not a Cobb-Douglas function. It's just something more general. So I do not specify the parametric form. And then as you go through the analytical results, you need to enforce more and more restrictions. So a lot of the results I'm about to show you will hold for a more general production function, as long as its constant returns to scale. And the second crucial bit is something called technology price single crossing property, which basically means that if you prefer a certain input to be outsourced, as you're changing prices of other things, this doesn't affect your decision, broadly speaking. This is how you can describe. So an answer to your question is the results do not rely on a Cobb-Douglas production function. There are some milder restrictions you can impose with, and still would hold. But for the quantitative results, I will still use the Cobb-Douglas specification only. So perhaps one thing I could do is to use the quantitative results, the calibration results, for more general production functions to see how well, for example, CES or something, how well the quantitative properties translate. Thanks a lot for this question.
For instance, I could imagine a situation in which there is only a single sector that buys from itself as intermediate input. So there is no role whatsoever for the number of links, but you allow the intermediate input share to vary as in the data or responding to the shocks that you can get, and you can compare to that model. And hopefully the results are going. Hopefully the results are going to be different. So there is more action here than what is encapsulated in the intermediate, in the variation, in the responsiveness of intermediate input shares to the shocks.
Yeah, so imagine I had a single sector which used labor and its own intermediate. A lot of the results I'm about to show you here will hold even in that setting, as long as the elasticity of substitution across labor and intermediate is very high, perhaps unrealistically high. And you need this kind of richer structure with many sectors and extensive margin decisions to compensate for the excessively high elasticity of substitution you'd require otherwise. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this question. So associated with this production function and a condition on this, certain choice of suppliers, you'd have this marginal cost expression, which of course falls in productivity. And it's then some combination between the cost of labor, which is the wage, and the prices set by other sectors, conditional on me actually buying from those sectors. And this equation basically sums up the whole mechanism of this paper. Whenever I choose to buy from a lot of sectors, this product term will become very long, which means all of the various price stickiness present in the other sectoral prices will travel to my marginal cost and make it more slow moving. Whenever I choose to not outsource, then this product term becomes very short and my marginal cost is mainly sensitive to the wage. So holding everything else fixed, the marginal cost is moving faster. Now, the final step of this is to choose the optimal number of suppliers, and you do that by choosing whichever minimizes your marginal cost. This is how you choose your network. And you can sort of see from the structure of this that because each firm in a given sector is sort of ex ante identical to each other. So there's no ex ante heterogeneity across the firms within each sector, which means they're all going to choose the same number, the same set of suppliers. So then we're going to make symmetric decisions.
Mishel?
Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask you something on this? So,
yeah.
So I see the intuition of sort of like carrying the sort of stickiness through the network. But then on the other hand, you're giving another degree of freedom for firms to respond, right? And that's going to go in the opposite direction, in the sense that you're going to have another object you can move around that's going to give you potentially flexibility in itself, right? That you wouldn't have in a model without the endogenous part. And that's going to go in the opposite direction in terms of giving you more flexibility. So is it correct to say that there's sort of a trade-off between sort of having this extra degree of flexibility that gives you some sort of like Le Chatelier principle that you can sort of, move away from negative shocks and take advantage of positive shocks. That goes in the opposite direction of sort of inheriting the price stickiness that those new links will give you.
Absolutely. So imagine this actually something will be pinning down the size dependence result. This is what drives the difference between very large negative shocks and very large positive shocks. So, for example, after a very large monetary contraction, you will be able to sort of shield yourself from that by switching to the more flexible input, which is the wage, and shielding yourself away from the sticky prices. So in terms of shielding yourself from a very large monetary contraction, this is exactly what's going to be happening. And in fact, this is something which would be true even if you did not have sticky prices. So for example, the paper by Mathieu Teixeira de Mishel, it shows that if you study cost of business cycles, allowing for the reorganization of the network and not allowing for it, it will always be unambiguously welfare improving for you to allow to reorganize your production network over the business cycle. So in a sense, what you're pointing to is actually something more general, not necessarily related to sticky prices.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the kind of real side of the problem for firms. And then there comes the nominal side. So it's a two-period problem. So firms know that tomorrow they will adjust prices for sure, which means the optimal reset price is just a fixed markup over the marginal cost, where the fixed markup takes a standard textbook form of some combination of tax levied by the government and the markup coming from market power within your sector. And crucially, again, there's no forward-looking component to this optimal reset price because it's a two-period problem. Then there's a nominal rigidity in that only a randomly selected fraction of firms within a sector can actually set this optimal reset price. And the remaining unlucky fraction have to set some exogenous price, PK0. And a crucial assumption that I'm making here is that this lottery for pricing is actually the same, no matter whether you're setting this price for the final goods market or whether you're setting this price to sell it as an intermediate. So we don't have very good data separately for price stickiness in the final goods market and price stickiness in the intermediate goods market. Maybe at the Bank of Chile, you have more granular data to pin down this difference across price stickiness. But for now, I'll have to assume that the stickiness is the same in the final goods market pricing and intermediate goods market pricing. Then this is it for firms. Household super standard, log linear utility, Cobb-Douglas aggregation across sectoral varieties. And to close the model, I assume a cash and advance constraint. So households need to have enough money to cover their final nominal demand. And the job of the central bank here is to actually manage this supply of money. So starting from some exogenous initial money supply M0, which you inherit from the previous central banker, the central bank makes an intervention in period one, epsilon M, which pins down period one money supply. And of course, this has an equivalent in the cashless limit, where this intervention is like setting the nominal interest rate between the two periods. You can think of it either as setting the money supply or as setting the nominal rate between the two periods. Okay, that's the whole model, at least in the two periods. The first thing I'll do is I'll consider the baseline of this economy. So imagine that the central bank makes no intervention and all outcomes are pinned down by two exogenous variables. The first one is this productivity mapping, and the second one is the initial level of money supply.
Michelle?
Yes. Yeah.
Here it's Gustavo from the bank. I have a question because it seems that, basically what firms are doing is kind of like changing technology, business cycle frequency, production technology. And like the only cost of changing it is like affecting the productivity, which gives you some continuity in terms of like choosing between these different possibilities. But I mean, you could also imagine that you have to pay a fixed cost, no cost in terms of lost productivity, and you can move, like for example, like to create a new link or basically jump to a new set of links. So that would create some sort of region of inaction, or like those things. So have you checked that assumption, like basically that you have only lost in terms of productivity and not maybe like a fixed cost of adjusting your relations?
Mm-hmm. So this is a great point. So a fixed cost would indeed generate a region of inaction, which in turn make optimal decisions about the production network sticky. So it would not be jumping up and down with your choices, which is actually something ultimately we'll see in the data, that the response of the decision on your network is very slow. But actually, it turns out that price rigidity in this model is doing exactly that without the need for fixed cost. Okay. And in fact, price rigidity is doing that enough to match the empirically observed sluggishness in the decisions about networks. Why? Because following, for example, a productivity improvement, the prices that my potential suppliers could charge me are falling very slowly because of price stickiness, which makes the decisions about the network endogenously sticky. So I need to wait for the cow or fairy to visit them enough times for them to drop their price by enough for me to actually decide to outsource. So in a sense, I agree that perhaps in real life there are fixed costs, but it just so happens that price stickiness alone is enough to generate enough persistence in decisions endogenously to match what I see in the data.
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
No, thanks a lot for this very important question. So what I'm going to do now is study the baseline or the deterministic steady state of this economy where justice, productivity, and money supply are sitting down everything. And I'll do that in the context of a simple two-sector version of this economy first, and then show you some formal results. So imagine that the subsidy from the government is optimal, so the reset price is just marginal cost pricing, and firms cannot trade within the sector. They can only form links across sectors. And imagine the following very, very simple setting. So the lowercase variables are just logs of capital letters. So the productivity mapping is such that if you buy nothing from the other sector, you get 1. If you buy something from the other sector, you get a bar. Then sector 1 is perfectly price flexible, and sector 2 is semi-sticky. So randomly selected half of firms are allowed to reset their prices. And there are only 4 possible equilibrium networks in this 2x2 game. So it's either empty from sector 1, sector 2 is back from sector 1, and so on. And the solution to this 2x2 game is pinned down by 2 parameters. The first one is the initial level of money supply, M0, and the second one is the mapping parameter A bar, which tells you how good the mapping is, quote unquote. Now let's vary these numbers to see what happens to the equilibrium network choice. So firstly, I'm fixing money supply and just varying the productivity parameter. If we are in a quote unquote recessionary state of the world where the productivity parameter is low, the equilibrium network is empty. If I increase this productivity parameter to 0.65, the sticky sector starts buying from the flexible sector. Why? Because it is exactly the flexible sector which can transform productivity parameter into lower prices. It becomes cost minimizing to outsource. Then if I increase this parameter even further to 0.8, even the partial downward adjustment of prices in the sticky sector is enough to make it cost minimizing for sector 1, the flexible sector, to outsource to sector 2. And the broad logic is that as I improve the value of the productivity parameter, the prices which are set by my potential supplier are weakly falling all the time, which means it always becomes weakly optimal for me to outsource more because the nominal wage is not changing, whereas the nominal price is weakly falling. So I get more links weekly as I'm improving the productivity parameter. And to go back to one of the questions we had early in the seminar, whether or not it matters that this parameter is sort of link specific. So the mapping is kind of also can vary with the various individual choices of sectors, even if A bar was your aggregate productivity parameter. So this was the productivity that you always get, no matter what you choose. As I'm increasing that, the effect would be qualitatively isomorphic. So as I'm increasing the aggregate productivity parameter, the nominal wage still remains unchanged, whereas the nominal price charged by potential suppliers falls. Now let's fix the productivity parameter and vary the money supply parameter instead. So if I'm in this quote unquote tight money state of the world, again, the equilibrium network is empty. If I increase the money supply parameter a tiny bit to 4, for example, then it is the flexible sector which wants to buy from the sticky sector. Why? Because it is the sticky sector which does not increase prices 1-for-1 following this change in money supply, whereas the nominal wage does increase 1-for-1, which means it becomes relatively cheaper for sector 1 to outsource in-house labor for intermediates bought from sector 2. And then if I increase money supply even further, even the sticky sector wants to buy from the flexible sector. Why? Because once the first link has been formed, the flexible sector starts inheriting stickiness, which means a further increase in money supply will not trigger a 1-for-1 increase in the prices of the flexible sector, which means it becomes cost minimizing for sector 2 to outsource to it. And the broad logic is that as I increase the money supply parameter, the price of my potential supplier increases at most 1-for-1, whereas the nominal wage I need to pay to my workers increases exactly 1-for-1, which means it becomes always optimal, weakly optimal for me to outsource more of the time. And actually, beyond the two sector example for arbitrarily many sectors, it turns out they can generalize this result. So up to one restriction, and this restriction is the quasi-submodularity of the marginal cost in the set productivity path. So quasi-submodularity is the equivalent of the second-order partial derivative for these non-differentiable environments. Basically, what this is saying is that as long as holding price is fixed, if I prefer a larger set of sectors to a smaller set of sectors, I will not stop preferring this for a better productivity mapping. This is like the equivalent of the partial derivative. But as long as that technical restriction holds, any two baseline pairs such that either the productivity mapping is better or the money supply is higher will always deliver more links in the baseline equilibrium. So whenever you either have a better productivity mapping or a better money supply, in steady state, you have weakly more links in this steady state. Okay, so this was the result for the baseline of this economy. Now let's see what happens when a central bank intervenes and perturbs a steady state with a monetary shock. And I'll consider two different kinds of shocks. Yes, is there a question?
Yeah, sorry. So before you go there, so this is something I missed. But then, so how do you deal with like? So in this literature, there's a lot of debates about how you make all these problems of optimal network tractable, and then I sort of missed how you deal with that. There are potentially many different options that each firm needs to evaluate. I mean, I guess here maybe you don't have so many sectors, but imagine you had a lot of sectors. This was very granular, so you had 6-digit sectors and so on. There would be many options of different combinations of sectors you can choose to kind of produce. How do you deal with that in the theory to make it tractable?
Yeah, so two things. The first thing which simplifies the problem a lot is that each firm within a sector is very small, which means it does not internalize the fact that it making some decision can reevaluate other firms' decisions. So it does not understand that its pricing decision, for example, affects the aggregate sectoral price index, which ultimately affects some other sector's decision about outsourcing. So it takes, in a sense, everything the rest of the economy is given whenever it's making every decision. And this is the first thing which simplifies a lot.
But still, okay, but still you have the issue that if you marginally add a new sector, imagine you're in equilibrium, you marginally add a new sector, that's going to change your marginal cost, and therefore it's going to change whether you want to have the other sectors that you previously had. So you're still going to have some interactions between even like forget about the so all firms are sort of continuous within a sector, but you're making decisions across sectors. There are many sectors, and whenever you evaluate a marginal sector, that's going to change the decision you want to make for the other sectors, right? How do you deal with that? I guess this is like, antitrust, no type of problems that it try to circumvent with different techniques, I guess.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think this goes back to the discussion we had with Ernesto about whether or not Cobb-Douglas is helping a lot. So this Cobb-Douglas resolved this thing very quickly because basically relative prices across sectors do not matter. So whenever you choose to outsource or not, the only thing which matters is whether the price charged by a specific sector is less than the wage you would need to pay. So if you look at the marginal cost expression, in a sense, all that matters is whether adding a specific supply is going to cost you less than paying the wage for that same cost share.
I see. But then if you had something like CES?
Yeah. So with CES, this would not work. Because it violates what's called the technology price single crossing property. So as I said, all of this works without Cobb-Douglas, but you need to have this single crossing property. And the single crossing property precisely ensures that a decision between producing something with labor or doing the same thing with some sector is not affected by the prices of the irrelevant sector, so to say. So it's like the equivalent of the independence of irrelevant alternatives, but in the production setting.
I see, but then in the more flexible case, in the more general case, in which you have CS and the elasticity of substitution can be anything, then it's not clear that you'll be able to solve the problem, I guess, or
not analytically for sure. So these results, the analytical results at least, they rely a lot on these environments where the independence of relevant alternatives type of property holds. So you don't need to check. So to be precise, this reduces the complexity of this problem from 2 to the power of k, where k is the number of sectors, where you need to check all possible, down to k squared, because you only need to check individual pairs. And you can see for a 6-digit economy, this is going to be one hell of a difference.
And okay, but then again, I guess the following question is whether do you think that in the data there are interaction across sectors not involved in sort of this, if you're evaluating one particular sector, whether the decisions on the other matter or not?
This is a great empirical question, I think. See if we can have some very granular data set to test that. That would be one step forward. I mean, I can see how you can relax this somewhat, where you don't need to keep track of all possible prices, but you can sort of group sectors again to see that, some sectors you don't touch and you can only outsource certain things, then this can potentially become tractable. But so you basically put restrictions on the choice of S. But beyond that, a lot of the results rely on this. I was going to say trick, but I'm going to say property of these production functions.
Okay, thanks.
But thanks a lot.
May I quickly jump in?
Yeah.
I'm going to try to be quick. Another dimension of Federico's comment has to do with wage rigidity. I'm sure that you get lots of questions about that. So the distribution of wage rigidity across the sectors or across the links also is going to be, I think, important in the quantitative bite of this mechanism.
So wage rigidity doesn't matter for the results of productivity, right? At least, so imagine I had my model, but added wage rigidity because nominal wage is sort of exogenous or equals money supply. Then if I made that rigid, it's like a more persistent exogenous process. So they don't matter for the productivity results. For money supply, they would, of course, quantitatively dampen them. And the extent to which they dampen them quantitatively is a quantitative question, which is something I can do in the big model. I haven't done that yet, but in the new, at least it's not in the paper yet. in the new iteration of the paper?
I don't think it's necessarily dampening because it depends on the distribution of weight rigidity across the different across firms and the potential suppliers. Because at the very end, what really matters is how the weight of the firm respond to the shock as opposed to the prices of potential suppliers. And if the price of potential suppliers doesn't respond much because their wages are very sticky, you're safe.
Yeah, so I mean, for now, there's only one wage, right, in this model. But and one, if I had a richer model, like I mean, your paper in the JME with sectoral, more segmented labor markets, then it could also amplify the results. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to investigate. So if I add segmented labor markets with wage rigidity. I mean, my understanding from the recent paper by John Grigsby and co-authors that there's not much heterogeneity in wage rigidity across sectors, but unlike prices. But I could still have that with segmented labor markets and see what happens. All right, so now let's see what happens with monetary shock. So the first kind of shock I consider is what I call a small monetary shock. And it's a strict definition in the paper that a shock is small if it does not change the equilibrium network compared to the baseline at which it arrives. So it's like a local shock, which keeps the network unchanged. And now let me consider several different baselines and perturb each of them with the same small shock. In particular, let's go back to the two-sector example and consider three different steady states. One, a recessionary steady state with an empty network, a normal steady state where productivity is intermediate and there's only one link, and an expansionary steady state where the network is complete. Let me perturb each of these steady states with the same small monetary expansion. If the monetary expansion arrives in the recessionary steady state, the flexible sector's consumption doesn't respond, but the sticky sector's consumption increases. So only one of the sectors responds. If the same shock arrives in the intermediate steady state, where the sticky sector is buying from the flexible sector, nothing changes. Why? Because the sticky sector's price setting is completely unaffected by buying something from a sector whose prices just moves up and down with the wage and hence with the money supply. But then if you have an expansionary steady state, where the flexible sector is buying from the sticky sector, you start inheriting the stickiness in price setting, and its consumption increases following the monetary shock. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, there are second order effects, higher order effects, where the sticky sector inherits its own stickiness because it buys from the sector which buys from itself, which then means its pricing is adjusting more slowly and its consumption is increasing by more. And more generally, for arbitrarily many sectors, this is what's called the cycle dependence result. You can have two steady states, one of which has a higher productivity mapping or a better productivity mapping. The same shock hitting the two baselines will always trigger a higher consumption response from the steady state with the higher productivity. Why? Because the steady state with the higher productivity will always have weakly more links. Then something very similar happens if you look across steady states with different initial level of money supply. So if you begin with tight money, the network is empty, only the sticky sector responds. But if you have a steady state with loose money where the network is complete, both sectors respond because they inherit stickiness from each other. And that's the path dependence result. So if you begin with a lot of money supply, you will begin with weakly more linkages, which means the same shock hitting you will trigger weakly larger real response. Final part is what I call large shocks. And I think it will speak to the question by Federico about the extra degree of freedom. Imagine the shock is so large, you can actually affect the equilibrium network relative to the baseline network when it arrives. Now let's again go back to the two-sector example. So on the horizontal axis, I have the magnitude of monetary shock starting from 0 in log. On the vertical axis, I have the aggregate consumption, aggregate GDP response. If I begin with an empty network and the expansionary shock is less than 3 in magnitude, then GDP will just grow linearly in the size of the shock, as would always be the case with Calvo pricing. Now, if the shock is big enough to trigger a connection going from the sticky sector to the flexible sector, the flexible sector's consumption will start responding to the shock, and hence the slope will increase. And finally, if the shock is so big and the network is complete, these higher order effects kick in and the slope rises even faster. So just to see this, imagine that the network was exogenous, then GDP will always rise linearly in the size of the shock, as you'll see in the dotted line. But this extra adjustment opportunity to create more links delivers a higher consumption response. And I think this speaks to the question by Federica about this extra margin of adjustment. So you see that consumption is increasing by more than what would happen under fixed exogenous networks. So in this sense, this extra opportunity to create links generates a higher consumption response.
But then for a negative shock, it will be the opposite.
Yeah, so exactly. So this is just first a formal result, but for the negative, you would see the exact opposite. So imagine I begin from a complete network. If the network was exogenously full, then larger contractions would deliver these kind of linear drops in GDP. But if I give the extra degree of freedom of getting rid of some links, then as I increase the size of the monetary contraction, the drop in GDP becomes smaller because firms can shield themselves from this by getting rid of firms that are not able to adjust their price. And hence the drop in GDP becomes smaller. And kind of from a policy perspective, I mean, I'm giving a talk at the central bank. From a policy perspective, this means that achieving a given level of contraction of GDP, if you want to cool down the economy, requires a weekly larger intervention from a central bank. So because firms are smart and they can shield themselves from the contractionary effects, you need to contract the economy by more. So you need to tighten your monetary policy by more to achieve a given level of contraction. Whereas for expansions, it will be the opposite. So if you want to stimulate the economy, and firms are smart, so they can take advantage of this, you actually need a smaller intervention, so you need smaller easing of policy to achieve a given increase in GDP, because firms would be, making use of this and forming more links. And again, this is a more general result which holds for arbitrarily many sectors. And if there's a lot of big literature where people are saying, look, if you have these size dependence responses, this means that Calvo is not a good model. You need many calls. Well, I'm not going to argue that Calvo is the best model out there. This is just to say that presence of size dependence in responses in the data is not necessarily indicative of many costs alone. So even with the Calvo model, you can have size-dependent responses of real variables or prices to shocks as long as networks are adjusting endogenous. Okay, so this was the two-period model.
Sorry for interrupting there. But I think that in the Menucos model, the effect will go in a counterfactual way. What you show at the beginning, the larger the shock, the larger is the real effect. In Menucos, the larger the shock, the smaller is going to be the real effect.
So many costs will work counterfactually for expansions. So for contractions, you see exactly this.
Okay, got it.
The problem is that when we study this question empirically, at least for the US, with the Roma-Roma shocks, the majority of the big shocks in the Roma-Roma series are contractionary shocks. So the size dependence you're identifying from the Roma-Roma series tends to be for the contractionary shocks. So you'll be sort of dealing with these situations. Maybe for other countries, you can do better than that. Okay, so this was a two-period model. Yes, there was a question?
Yes, here, Jorge, from the bank. How are you?
Mm-hmm.
So your model then would deliver, if you just think about the central bank is not internalizing this asymmetry in the effect of the shocks, positively skewed business cycle, basically, if monetary policy is a key stabilizer.
Positively skew. Well, if a good question. Would it be positive? Even so, I think a model with endogenous networks in general would deliver a positive skew relative to a model with fixed networks for sure.
With the fixed network, yeah. So it will reduce because in the data we have negatively skewed business cycles, which probably you're not fitting here, but you would say this feature of the economy would mitigate that.
Perhaps, yes.
And the other thing that is related to this, it's very important for the assumptions you're making on Federico's questions, for example, what we mean by a sector. Is it like the tire for a car manufacturer, or is the type of tire, right? So is it just a supplier, producer? And the fact you talk about outsourcing, I think, is because you want to talk about industries, right, rather than varieties within an industry. But instead of as a complementing outsourcing, you can also think of over the business cycle, firms making products more complex. In expansions, you're the car seller, provides coffee to the buyers, to the people waiting. But in recessions, there is no coffee out there, so you don't have the service. You don't need to talk necessarily about outsourcing, right? The reason you are giving that example is just because you think it's sticky network otherwise. Is that the reason?
In my dream world, I would want to write this paper at the firm level, and not to have to deal with the question of what is an industry, what is a sector. The problem is that imagine we just had a fixed number of firms, then all the sticky price machinery of Calvin would not work because the law of large numbers would break down. So the problem would just become intractable very quickly, because when I aggregate this problem, I would need to keep track of who adjusted and when. I can write this problem for a fixed number of firms in a 2-period setting. And then all of these effects would hold. But this would, so in a sense, this is not a property of sectors and firms. But an infinite horizon problem would be very intractable. But I think where we should be moving, as people working in this field, to having firm level models, not to deal with these issues, and somehow come up with a way to keep track of prices very well, in the sticky price environment.
Yeah. So one last thing, an issue to me there is like when you have the industries, the assumption of the cross price irrelevance that you need, it makes more sense to me because you have a technology that is not super easy to change. It depends on what you're producing. It's particular to your technology. But when you go super disaggregated, it's kind of harder to make that point because you have the supplier next door, So that's what.
Yeah, but then you can sort of make simplifications of the sort we've discussed, right? So you can only keep track of some individual subset of prices which are relevant for the decision or something.
I'm thinking of how you think it of the real world.
Yeah, that's definitely. Let me write this down. Yeah, that's definitely something we should be thinking, a lot more about. All right, so this was a 2-period problem. Let me briefly, whiz you through the infinite horizon setting. So the only difference now is that firms have many periods ahead of them. So now they're choosing the optimal reset price to maximize future discounted profits. Well, of course, in this sticky price environment, you only care about some profit in the future to the extent to which your prices may remain stuck up until that point, and after the discount now. Then to make any statement, and firms can re-optimize supplier choices in every period. So now to make further numerical exercises, I need to make a parametric assumption about this technology mapping. And I take the form from Asamoah and Azar 2020, which assume a multiplicative productivity mapping. So for any choice of suppliers, the productivity that you get from there has an aggregate component Z, which is your productivity term, aggregate productivity, and it's then some product of link-specific productivity. So if you, as a firm in sector K, connect to sector R, your productivity increases multiplicatively by BKR. And the reason why this mapping is so convenient, and it goes back to, I think, the discussion with Federico, is that once you write down the marginal cost function associated with this productivity mapping in logs, basically all of your decisions about links are only in this summation term, which means you should only connect as a firm in sector K to sector R if the price gain that you get from it, so if as long as the prices in that sector are lower than the wage by a certain amount, which means to check if a particular network arrangement is optimal, you only need to check this condition for every pair of sectors K and R, and there are K squared of them, instead of checking 2 to the power of K options. So you can very, very quickly check if a given network arrangement is optimal. But still, this is an infinite horizon problem, so the solution is non-trivial. And one approach I suggest to solve this type of problems with kind of extensive margin decisions and an infinite horizon problem is the following. So I assume that there exists a cutoff period, capital T, beyond which prices are flexible. And this capital T could be a very, very large number, whereas prices between period 1 and period capital T are sticky, which means for a firm at period capital T minus 1, it knows it will adjust prices tomorrow for sure. So it's basically solving a static problem at period capital T minus 1. So how this algorithm works, you enter this algorithm with some guess for the path of prices and the path of network choices. You go to the period just before the cutoff. You solve for the prices in that penultimate period. And then, given those prices you have solved for, you check all the individual edge conditions. So you re-optimize the network if needed. Then you again resolve for the prices, and you do that until convergence within that time period. Then you go by backward induction one step before that, and now you only need to look one period ahead. But everything you need to know about the future has already been solved for over here, which means, again, you can solve this problem for prices, check all the edge conditions, resolve for the prices, and do that until convergence within the time period. And then you keep on doing that all the way until the first time period. And this gives you some path of prices, sectoral prices, and a path for network choices. And the final thing you need to check is whether or not this path is the same one as the one you have entered the algorithm with, so whether you have convergence across time periods. If you do not have convergence across time periods, then you go back to the cutoff period, solve the problem again, and you keep on doing that until convergence, both within each time period and across time periods. This is how you solve this problem. Finally, a brief note on calibration, so I'm not going to stop here too much, but I calibrate this for 389 sectors of the US economy, so 6 digits. A lot of the aggregate parameters is standard. Perhaps the only thing I should mention is that the sector-specific caliber parameters have been kindly provided by Ernesto and co-authors. And yeah, perhaps the sector-specific taxes need to calibrate to have the markups in steady state consistent with the data. So briefly on the quantitative result. So let's see.
Sorry.
How much time do you have?
So you have, let's give it another 12 minutes. We've had a lot of discussion, so let's give it 11 minutes or so. But I wanted to, I mean, before you go to the quantitative results, whether you have something on like non-targeted moments. I guess you were saying something on, before you were talking about that the Calvo stickiness gives you enough power to predict some stickiness also on the extensive margin. Do you have something on that? To kind of, I mean, how good that does that work?
Yeah, so exactly. This is the untargeted moment. So this mechanism produces like the impulse response of the entire input-output structure to an MIT shock. And then I have the equivalence of that in the data. So what I'll do in the empirical section, I'll estimate the impulse response of the number of links and of the intermediate intensity to the same shocks, and see whether the model can produce the same magnitude and persistence of the response of the number of links and the intermediate intensity to shocks. All right, so jumping straight into that. So first, let's see what happens with the baseline of this economy following MIT shocks to either productivity or money supply. So let's first consider MIT shocks to aggregate productivity. So relative to the baseline where productivity is at its steady state value, a one-time 3% productivity improvement gives you roughly 27 more suppliers per sector. And this effect is super persistent. So even 6 years after this one-time productivity improvement, it's kind of still there. And crucially, the effect is asymmetric. So a 3% productivity contraction, one-time contraction, makes you lose only about 10 suppliers. And this asymmetry is just a purely quantitative property of this model. So there's nothing in all of this which tells you the responses should be symmetric. And it's just a quantitative property of this, which can be tested later, that the contractions, productivity, are not breaking your network by as much as improvements of productivity are building it up. And on the right-hand side, you just have the translation of these numbers into what this means for the average intermediate intensity. So after a 3% productivity improvement, your average intensity or cost share of intermediates rises by about 0.06. And then similar results for money supply improvement. So relative to steady state, if I do a one-time improvement of money supply by 6%, again about 27 extra suppliers. But if I contract my money supply by 6%, I only lose about 12 suppliers. And again, crucially, although these are one-time improvements in money supply, the effects are very long-lived. So even after 2 or 3 years after this improvement, the network has not jumped back to a steady state value. And all of this is delivered only by price stickiness. And again, on the right-hand side, I have the translation of these numbers into intermediate intensity. The next exercise is to take each of those baseline paths we had before and perturb each of them with a small monetary shock and record the impulse response of GDP around each of those baselines. So the solid black line on the left-hand side figure is the impulse response of GDP around the most expansionary productivity baseline. So if productivity is already very high, and I've perturbed that baseline with a small monetary shock, my GDP peaks at about 0.2 in its increase. But if the very same shock perturbs a very low productivity baseline, it only peaks at about 0.16. So the gap between these two lines is about 16%. So this is the kind of cycle-dependent quantification. But crucially, since this response of the network is asymmetric across productivity contractions and expansions, the effect on the GDP response is also that kind of doesn't grow linearly. So if I normalize the response in the most contractionary baseline to 1, then the difference between the response in the most contractionary baseline and just this steady state is not that large, because the network doesn't break all that much between the low productivity state and the steady state. But the response in the high productivity baseline is much, much higher, which sort of means that these asymmetries between monetary policy in good times and bad times is mainly driven by monetary policy being super effective in good times, whereas its effectiveness doesn't drop by the same amount in bad times. So from the kind of central bank perspective, your policy becomes a disproportionately better tool for cooling the economy down in good times relative to stimulating it in bad times. Again, very similar results for baseline initial money supply. So if you begin with a lot of money in the system, GDP will respond by more. If you begin with much less money in the system, GDP will respond by less to the very same shock. And these are kind of the basic quantitative properties of this model, which we can then compare to the data, which will be my final part of the presentation, so the empirical evidence, unless there are any questions about the quantitative part.
So, Mishel, you have 5 minutes to go.
Yeah, let me whiz through the empirical evidence. So first, with sectoral data, one sense check you need to do. So if all I do has any traction, then the cost share of intermediates should be highly procyclical. And you can exactly see that in the aggregate data. So in recessions, the cost share of intermediates is dropping, including the Volcker disinflation period, which was caused by a monetary contraction. Then I construct these measures of intermediate intensity for 65 sectors of the US economy. Unfortunately, I cannot go more granular than that. And I study in a local projection setting how these intermediate intensities respond to identified shocks at various horizons. And I consider Fernald TFP shocks for productivity changes and Roma monetary shocks for money supply changes. So first, with a simple linear local projection, you see that following either productivity expansion or monetary easing, intermediate share is rising, just as predicted by the model. This was a quick sense check. But then to test for the more granular predictions, like the lumpiness in adjustment and the sign asymmetry, I'm considering a nonlinear local projection specification where I'm allowing for sign effects here and size effects. And then once you consider the nonlinear local projection setting, you can see two crucial things. Firstly, just as in the model, productivity contractions are giving you a much smaller drop in intermediate intensity and magnitude compared to a productivity expansion of the same magnitude. So just as we saw in the quantitative model, productivity contractions are giving you a much smaller drop in intensity than productivity expansions of the same magnitude do. And then quantitatively, a 3% TFP expansion gives you a intensity improvement or increase of about 0.06, which is very close to what you had in the big model. And a 3% contraction gives you about 0.02 drop, again, very similar to what you had in the big quantitative model. And you can compare them more tightly in the paper. For monetary expansions, a very similar thing occurs. So monetary contractions don't give you a very big drop in intensity, whereas monetary expansions do give you a big rise in intensity. And quantitatively, once you compare this plot to big model, you get similar peak effects. Final slide is firm level data to test the extensive margin of adjustment. And for that, I'm using the CompuStat data set and the work done by Engin Atillay and co-authors on top of that to recover the number of suppliers each firm in CompuStat has between 1976 and 2007. And then I can rerun the very same regressions with the in degree or the number of suppliers of each firm as my dependent variable. And once again, following either productivity expansion or monetary easing, the number of suppliers increases. And that's just a sense check because this is a linear local projection. Once you allow for nonlinearities, you see that productivity expansions give you a rise in the number of suppliers, whereas productivity contractions give you no effect pretty much. So if you draw bands around this, this would be like no effect. So productivity contractions do not give you a drop in the number of suppliers, but productivity expansions do give you a rise in the numbers. Unfortunately, this is hard to compare to the big model because this is just for the subset of publicly listed firms, whereas the model for the whole economy, but at least directionally it's the same. Monetary expansions very similar qualitative properties. So monetary contractions don't give you a big drop in the number of suppliers, whereas the expansions do. I think I'm about to overstate my overstay my welcome, so I'll just conclude here. So today I've shown you a sticky price model with endogenous formation of input-output linkages, which gives you a realistic cyclical variation in the number of links and intermediate intensity. And a model like that can rationalize at least 3 empirically documented nonlinearities in monetary transmission. Final point is that this is part of a much larger agenda, so perhaps most interesting or relevant for the audience here is that in general, all of these input-output linkages which are formed here are inefficient. In this case, because of inefficient markups coming from market power and sticky prices, but a more general question of interest is to what extent is the misallocation we see at the micro level driven by inefficient choices of suppliers, and what are the government policies that could be used to kind of trigger efficient formation of links in a decentralized equilibrium. That's it. Happy to take more questions. Thanks a lot again for inviting me.
Thanks a lot, Mishel, for your presentation and for good administration of time. So we have 10 more minutes for discussion. So if you have any questions or comments, just fire away. I have a small, in the meantime, just a small comment on like this sectoral versus firm discussion we had before and that Jorge also brought up, which is, it seems to be that there's some sort of a tension in the sense that I can see that, you know, if you're making the decision at a sort of sectoral level, this kind of is a big deal, right? Because there you could potentially change a lot, sort of the stickiness of price adjustment, because very different sectors are very different in terms of how they adjust prices, right? So then that's going to give you a big kick on sort of on your mechanism. But at the same time, you were sort of saying that you would like to do this at the firm level, but then at the firm level, you know, that might be muted because if you're switching between different suppliers within the same sector, potentially nothing is going to change in terms of stickiness of prices, right? So, and then, you know, if you think, I mean, and then you were talking about outsourcing. So then when you think about outsourcing, you're thinking something a bit more sort of an outsourcing decision is something a bit more sort of sectoral type of level of decision, not sort of so much which supplier you're using. So then it's kind of, it's not really clear to me, like sort of at which level of aggregation you think the model is more reasonable in terms of its goals. And then sort of following on that, do you have anything in the empirical results looking at the effects in the number of sectors that you're responding to? I mean, you show it on the firm level, but I guess, you know, in principle, it should also hold at the sector level, given the implications of the model.
Yeah, so starting from the second question, actually, unfortunately, you do not track the big input-output networks, say the 6 digits in the US, for very long. So you only have them for 2017, 2012, 7, and 2. And before that, the sectoral definitions are different and so on. And it's only every 5 years. So it's very hard to, you know, get data on the number of sectors from which you're outsourcing, which has a very long time series, at least for the US, maybe in Chile or in other countries. You can track the actual sectoral input-output networks at annual frequency going back to the 70s or the 60s. I don't know. So that's the crucial issue, which made me focus on the intermediate intensity, which can be tracked for a long time. In terms of the discussion on outsourcing, so I think what I really meant was I wanted this ideally in kind of perfect world to be a model at the firm level, where firms are not only making about which firm to connect to within each sector, but also which firm to which could be millions potentially. And then you're making outsourcing decisions which are not necessarily within a given sector or sectoral definition, but very broad. Then it could be something. It would be something very similar to what the decision firms are making in the current model, but a lot less tractable potentially. But the issue is adding price stickiness on top of that. So then the requirement to keep track of who adjusted and when, it becomes just mind-boggling.
Okay. Anyone else? We still have a couple of minutes for more questions. I guess one other thing I was thinking is that you know, this issue with the elasticity of substitution in production. So forget about like the problem of solving this model. If you have like a more general CS you know, aggregation of inputs, sort of your argument of inheriting sort of price stickiness also holds for like inheritance of the flexibility of production itself, right? So, you know, like connecting to a supplier that comes from an industry in which there's complementarity in production must be very different than coming from a sector that has a supplier that comes from a sector that has a lot of flexibility in production. Right. So, you know, in the limit, if you're just connecting with a lot of suppliers up the supply chain that come from like complementarity, you know, potentially there, the forces of propagation are going to be much stronger than if you connect with sectors that have a lot of substitutability in production. So I'm wondering, like, to what extent that's going to compete with sort of the stickiness that you're inheriting from other sectors. With this extreme of thinking about, you know, whether production of your suppliers and so on going up is flexible. I mean, is substitutable or complementary. So I'm guessing, like, in the limit, it must be that parameter is going to be very important if you were able to solve that analytically, right? But at least, you know, in the quantifactuals, it should be also very important if you move around that parameter, how strong the effects will be, and maybe at some point they can go in the opposite direction, in the sense that if you have a lot of flexibility in the production, maybe that's gonna be more powerful than the stickiness that you're inheriting.
Yeah, this is a great point. I haven't thought about that too thoroughly, but I suspect that all of these effects about, you know, whether you're connecting to a firm which has substitutability or not, complementarity, it's gonna pin down some kind of long run effect more than business cycle fluctuations. Because I suspect, like, production properties of your potential suppliers are probably going to affect the markups they're charging, kind of the long run desired markup, and that was probably going to have more of a long run effect than kind of business cycle effect. But perhaps all of these effects coming from stickiness will sort of fluctuate around the trend set by ultimate production properties of your potential suppliers. There's more kind of a cyclical versus secular effect, I suspect. But that's something that, yeah, will be very interesting to investigate formally.
Okay. Yeah, because at the end of the day, I mean, you're focusing on one mechanism, which is sort of this pass-through of, you know, stickiness along the supply chain. But when you're building these linkages, you also passing other things along, right? And those other things could be either contributing to more flexibility or contributing to more stickiness, and that's going to depend on sort of which dimension you're focusing on. But it's, you know, it could go either way, I guess. So I mean, one of this example was with this sort of production substitutability, but you can think of other things. Maybe, you know, financial frictions or other frictions that you can sort of pass along the supply chain that could give you more flexibility or more constraints.
Yeah, crucially, that the assumption is that the kind of it's Cobb-Douglas across sectors, both for final households and for firms in terms of their potential suppliers.
Yeah.
Whereas imagine you had perfect substitution across suppliers and Cobb-Douglas across households, and you could set separate prices in the final goods market and separate prices in trade across firms. That would change results quite substantially, I think. But then we don't have very, I mean, apparently, I mean, maybe with the data you have at the bank, you can pin down stickiness separately for inter-firm trade and final goods trade, in which case this would be, very interesting enrichment.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
I just want to like kind of complement what you were saying, Federico, in terms of how because we're doing like two assumptions when you aggregate this input. The first one is that it's a class, and the other one is that, and I think this was mentioned earlier, is that there is no cost of switching as well. So that it's going to add an extra layer and an extra effect on this kind of. It can also pick up some of the rigidity that you find, because it might be that some sectors are more. I mean, this might be a small quantitatively, I don't know, like that where it's more contract based, and therefore maybe in terms of reproduction function, there is a large elasticity of substitution, but in terms of whether you can switch away from them, might not be as much, and that could also like have be connected to the actual price rigidity. I'm just thinking of like some sectors being more more prone to dealing contracts, and other ones more on like on spot basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think one extension I'm thinking of adding to this is basically can add an iceberg cost to this problem, where imagine there's a productivity improvement, and instead of simply comparing the wage and the price you would need to pay to a potential supplier, you're comparing the wage to the price of that supplier plus the iceberg cost. So I think in that world, even without price stickiness, you still have like persistent adjustment. The question though is how you can calibrate that iceberg cost without, I mean, you could calibrate it by matching the observed persistence to the one in the model. But to do that kind of to leave the impulse response comparison as an untargeted moment, a bit non-trivial to me. Whereas the stickiness you can calibrate directly from the observed frequency of price adjustment.